Well, first and foremost, I'd like to thank Mary Morris and the Human Relations Committee for inviting me to give a talk. I do apologize that I will not be able to be there today due to a prior engagement, but I felt that this was such an important thing, and so did Professor Brian Levin, the director of our Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, that we wanted to at least be able to send this video to talk briefly about some of the things that can be done to address the current concerns by many in our community about what to do after the recent attacks in San Bernardino. Hopefully today I'll be able to talk a little bit about that. But let me introduce myself first. My name is Dr. Kevin Grisham. I'm the Assistant Director of Research at the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino. Most people know of our center due to Professor Brian Levin's work in the media, both before the attacks in San Bernardino, but also since that time. And of course, I serve as his sort of number two person, and am in charge of the development of our research agenda at the center. In addition to that, I also serve as the assistant professor for geography and environmental studies and the coordinator of the global studies option at California State University, San Bernardino. And most of the coursework I teach center around issues of globalization, human geography, as well as increasingly issues on conflict of all various forms. Particularly why I work at the center is because my scholarship for almost 20 years now has focused on political violence in all its various forms, including terrorism, and my regional expertise is still in today, even though I do work around the world, on the Middle East and North Africa. And this includes, of course, spending time and working in the region. The longest, of course, I lived in Yemen in 1999 and 2000, just on the eve on the war of terrorism. I was working there, and I continue to work in that capacity. Prior to joining the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, I served for almost 5 years as the director for the Center for Islamic and Middle East Studies at California State University, San Bernardino, which is the flagship center of its kind in the CSU system and one of a handful in the Western United States. And regularly I'm asked to speak on a variety of issues concerning extremism and hate, and particularly in this day and age, any sort of discussion concerning the motivations behind extremists that sometimes come from Middle East and North Africa, particularly being on BBC World News, at the United Nations, and many other places, to talk about groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or many of the other sort of splinter groups off of these. So hopefully, based on my background, I'll be able to give you a little bit of insight into how to address the issues that have occurred in our community since the attacks in December. I should start with sort of a very basic sort of personal note, and that is that I'm an alumni of Cal State San Bernardino, and I've actually lived in the Inland Empire for a little over 20 years now. I still reside actually in the Inland Empire in Moreno Valley, California. And so when the attacks occurred on December 2nd, 2015, for me it was very much not just losing the people you see before you, the 14 individuals from our community. It was also very much an attack on our own. It reminded me of one of my favorite quotes from John Donne's Meditation 17, also known as For Whom the Bell Tolls, where he says, "No man is an island entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a part of the main." And what's important about that is that in losing these individuals and all the people who were affected, who weren't necessarily lost but were injured or were psychologically damaged because of the events, I would argue, it is our mandate as a community to come together and have these discussions so that the tragedy that led to these individuals' deaths, as well as the people who were affected by it in our community, do not go in vain, and that hopefully we won't have issues like this again in our community. So let me start by why it's so important to be talking about this. During this presidential election cycle, there has been a lot of discussion on both sides of the political aisle, both Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, about how to address the issue of the attacks, not just in San Bernardino, but also the attacks in Paris and Brussels more recently, and really what we should be saying about, quote unquote, what often people talk about, Islamic extremists. Back in January of this year, the Pew Research Center, which is one of the foremost centers for the study of religious life and they do a variety of studies and are very highly regarded throughout the world. Did a study in which they asked people basically how the next president should talk about Islamic extremists, and obviously this is very important as we go into an election cycle. And as you can see, there is sort of a divide within the United States based on the sample of how basically we should be talking about Islam itself and Islamic extremists. And obviously that's a very important and part of the reason why we should be having these conversations, because we tend to forget that Muslims are our neighbors. And Islam itself as a faith is actually almost as old as the United States. Muslims have been in the United States for most of its history in one form or another, and it is not Muslims are not a recent sort of group that's come to the United States, and I think very often people forget about that historically. And so to sort of talk about this one particular religious group as connected to some of the extremism you see today, we have to have those conversations so that we may not marginalize our neighbors and place blame on them possibly that they definitely don't deserve. And also, it's not just based on politics. We can also see how this impacts when the same research was done, broken down by level of education, age, ethnicity, religious affiliation, that there's clearly some divides in the United States currently, and more recent data since January sort of suggests the same. That if we're going to have conversations about what we should be doing with our fellow neighbors who happen to follow the Islamic faith, that this is a conversation that we definitely need to be having now about what is extremism, what is hate, how do we deal with it, because remember that hate and extremism isn't unique to one religious faith or one ideology, that there are many historical accounts, even more recent ones in the United States, that were non-Muslims actually have committed acts of atrocity against their fellow Americans. So for the next about 15 to 20 minutes, I'd like to talk about the following. Talk a little bit about what is hate. Obviously, at the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, we do very much focus on what is hate, what is hate speech, what is the laws concerning hate speech, which is really the area of Professor Levin, who's a lawyer. But also in my own research studying sort of the terrorism and some of the other issues for the center, we obviously need to know a little bit about hate. So we'll talk a little bit about what hate is, and probably come to no full conclusion, but at least give you some things to think about after you leave today. We'll talk a little bit about possible motivations behind hate. There are scholars like myself and others, and like Dr. Levin, who have studied hate for many, many, many years, for decades and decades, and you're going to find many different explanations out there. But this is at least to start to think about how to look at why people are motivated to hate each other, regardless of what group they come from. We'll talk a little bit about hate as a weapon of the weak. It's often seen as something that can be used by people when they are at their weakest to justify their own actions, their own agenda out there. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then end by talking about, which I think is the most important point of today in this great conversation you'll be having, is what can we do as a community in the Inland Empire to sort of go beyond December 2nd, 2015. I think very often a lot of people tend to focus on sort of the extremism aspect of it, and really what we should be thinking about is how do we rebuild our community in the sense of the relationship between various neighbors in our community itself. So let's start by talking a little bit about what is hate. And there's many different definitions of hate out there. If we go back far enough into the various history of the world, we can see many definitions that have been used. But if we start with a very basic dictionary definition, Merriam-Webster says that hate is to, quote, to feel extreme enmity toward or to have a strong aversion to. And so obviously, if we're just using this definition, we know and we can say that there's probably a lot of things that we as individuals, we as groups hate. And so we'll come back to that point in a few minutes. But remember that the discussion of hate is nothing new. It's actually been something that's talked about in the past as well as in the present. For example, Descartes and Aristotle sort of framed it in the context of that we are judging, creating a negative judgment about an object. So we see something, we judge it, and in that judgment we are hating through judgment. But others like Spinoza, Hume, and Darwin argue that it's not about judgment, but more importantly about feeling. In other words, how we feel about something. So we're not judging as black and white, but we're actually putting our feelings and our emotions as attached to, and our negative feelings towards this object of hatred itself. And Elster in 1999, a very well-known scholar in this area, argued that hate is an emotion where one has to determine another to be evil. So you can see through just these few examples that the discussion of hate has changed over time from judgment to feeling, and then related more back to sort of a combination of judging plus the feeling aspect through this emotion and determining another to be evil. And that's important because if we are to judge something as to be evil, we need to remember that all of these are very subjective and often can be manipulated, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. But one of the things we need to be very clear of is often when people talk about hate, they talk about it as if it is very irrational. When groups hate, when people hate something, economists, political scientists, many people would argue it's not irrational at all. It's extremely rational, that they've looked at what that thing can do to them to cost them more in a given action, or if it's going to benefit them more. And so doing sort of these calculations is really rational in its very sense. So if I hate something because it's going to cause a greater detriment to my own life, then one could argue that it's extremely rational. And probably where this idea that hate is irrational comes from is this idea going back to Descartes, Aristotle, Spinoza, and all these in the past, that it's really about feelings. Often we think of feelings as being irrational, but we tend to forget that both feelings as well as the actions associated with feelings tend to be associated with real-life decision-making, and often that is done based on the rationality of the individual. So when we think about, for example, children, and we think about whether or not that they want to eat vegetables, you could argue that the child is being irrational to hate broccoli. But in their mind, they have taken some calculation, some would say, well, I just don't like the taste of this. I've thought about what the benefit of it, the pleasure of eating broccoli is, and what the displeasure of it was, and I've made a decision to not like it. And if we make this sort of same comparison with groups like ISIS and others, as well as groups in the United States that are left and right of the political spectrum that are extremists, not the normal mainstream, but I'm talking about violent extremists, from all walks of life throughout the world, we can actually see that from their viewpoint, that what they are doing, including in some cases killing themselves and killing others, is extremely irrational act. And therefore, to sort of look at it as being irrational sort of gives them, in some ways, I would argue, more power, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, because what you're suggesting to them is what they want isn't important at all. And we'll talk about how there's a way to actually stop this kind of activity by recognizing that part itself. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the motivations behind hate. And one of the things we should think of when we think about what we mean by various sort of theories that explain motivations of hate is we can go to the very ancient Buddhist parable of the blind scholars and the elephants. And for those of you who don't know this parable, the argument is that you would have these blind scholars that were brought in, had never seen an elephant, and then they were they surrounded the elephant and they started to touch just one part of the elephant. So if a person is touching its trunk, they may think it's not a branch of a tree, but that it's a snake. If they're feeling just the side of an elephant, they may think it's a wall. And so just from their very small viewpoint, they may come to some sort of conclusions, but that may not be the truth, because obviously an elephant is much bigger than just its single parts. And so hate and many other sort of things that face human beings often, I think, can be seen as the same way. Hate is very hard to define. That's why there's no clear definition of hate. If you ask many different scholars what hate is, you're going to get many different definitions. If you ask them why hate occurs, they will also give you many different theories. And the reason for that is because realistically, probably why hate occurs is very made up of many different factors and not individual factors themselves. But let's look at least of a few more recent arguments that have been made about why hate occurs. A very famous scholar by the name of Schaeffer wrote in 2011 that, quote, "Not all insecure people are haters, but all haters are insecure people." And through his 7-stage hate model, he actually argues very simply that these insecure people use hate to sort of motivate people towards this achievement and trying to sort of minimize their insecurity. Others, also recently, like Zika and Romea, argue that hate is actually wired into our brain. The brain circuits basically are not the same for fear, threat, and danger, but what's interesting is that hate actually may have some connection to the same part of our brain that deals with aggression and love, but we also need to remember that there's distinct wiring. So there may be actual neuropsychological connection to why people hate. It's not just simply a calculation. But what I would like to argue, and sort of this is my perspective as a scholar, somebody who studies extremism and teaches on these issues, is that there might be actually a connection socio-psychologically between the ideas of ignorance, fear, and hate. So let me explain what I mean by that. So if we think about basically the world itself, and we think about the fact that there's a lot of things that we are very ignorant about. Ignorance is nothing more than the fact that you just don't know something about anything. It's a lack of information, as I often tell my students. The very first day of class, I often tell the students from the very beginning, you're all ignorant, which you can imagine goes over very well for the students. But what I'm saying is that we're all ignorant about something. So, for example, I do not know much about working on cars, so I hire a mechanic to work on my car because I'm ignorant about the process of how engines work, how brakes work. And so all of us are ignorant a little bit about something. But very often what happens in real life is that those things that we are ignorant about, a lot of people will actually be fearful. And that's a very natural human reaction, to be fearing something we don't know anything about. And sometimes we come to some conclusions as well because of that. And it just continues the fear of the things we don't know, and then we kind of create these illusions about what we think, often continues to feed into the fact that we are still ignorant about the issue, and it elevates that fear. When the fear sort of drives ignorance, the problem is that when fear continues to drive the ignorance, what could happen sometimes is it could create hate. It could create us to actually take actions that are emotionally as well as physically to hate another. And often there's a direct connection between those things we don't know, then creating fear, and then us acting out of fear, and then hate comes from often that. In fact, one of the things that often happens in this process is that we often split the world into these two camps of us versus them. One of the things that often I ask students or other people when I go to talks like this is, how do you know yourself in the world? How do you define who you are? And one of the ways that we define ourselves as human beings is by who we are not. So therefore, we often split the world into who we are and who we are not, this very us versus them. And when we are ignorant about something and we fear it, that's become very entrenched in sort of this bifurcation or the separation into the camps of the us versus them. Now, what becomes even more problematic, though, is that when economic and political elites around the world see this and they use that to their advantage by manipulating sort of the fear. In other words, in the depiction you see on this slide here, that they actually turn up the flame of fear, which just boils the ignorance even more, which causes even greater hate. And we do know that a lot of extremist groups, violent extremist groups from around the world, that often their leadership are highly educated, and they do know very much what they are doing. I can tell you, having interviewed groups around the world and others who, like myself, who study these groups, that there's a common theme, and that is very often you find out, and talking to them, they will never say this, but it's clear that they are trying to manipulate the reality that is being fed to the people who follow them so that they continue to be in power, whether that be economic power, political power, or just status in general. Now, let's talk a little bit about then how do we sort of think about this? Well, in this day and age, if you turn on the media, it's pretty obvious that terrorism tends to be something that's very ever present. If you've been watching the news in the last couple of days with the down Egypt airline, there was immediately speculation within minutes of the downing, both on social media and the news, that, oh, this is a terrorist attack. And whether that turns out to be true or not, that was based on basically very little to no information. And so very often we tend to distort what the actual threat is versus a perceived threat. And if we're going to talk about sort of how we move beyond the attacks in San Bernardino this past December, we need to at least, I would argue, work in reality, work in the real numbers. What do the numbers say? What kind of threat do we have against us? So what you see before you is actually from the START program at the University of Maryland, which is a center that is funded by the Department of Homeland Security, and they collect data throughout the world, but particularly in the United States, concerning terrorist attacks and many other issues, and they're considered one of the foremost centers in this area. And so this data that they collected from 1995 to 2014, as you can see, shows the actual number of terrorist attacks, at least as defined by the U.S. government as terrorist attacks, in the United States. And so if you look at 2001, the attacks on 9/11 would be included in this. You'll notice that actually in previous years, 95, 99, the number of attacks were actually much higher than in 2001. But obviously, I think we can all agree the attacks on 2001 had much higher fatality rates because of the one event. If we then look at that and compare it to, let's say, 2013, just randomly picking this date, you can see that there's been increasingly a downward sort of threat. And this is based on real numbers, that there has been less terrorist attacks, there have been less people killed. But if you were to turn on the news, you would assume that there's a terrorist attack every day in the United States, and that we are always under potential threat. But let's compare this to other potential threats that we as Americans face, including here in the Inland Empire. If you look at the National Institute of Health and the Center for Disease Control statistics on why people die in the same year as 2013, if you remember when you looked at the last number, and you see this over here in the blue that says total fatalities in the U.S., that actually the total fatalities in the U.S. is extremely, extremely low when compared to other people who died in that exact same year due to heart disease, suicide, cancer, diabetes, accidents, and this is just a handful. There's many more of the reasons people died in that same year. That of the 2.5 million people in the United States who died that year, the amount that actually died due to terrorism was extremely minuscule. This is not to suggest that terrorism and people who die aren't important, because they are, but we do need to at least put it in perspective as we think this through in the case of policy, but also as people involved in our communities. Now, what tends to perpetrate that sort of idea that there's a constant threat in the world is part of it is the media. And I can't blame the media completely here, but the media does play a huge role. Because often the indirect role of the media is you tend to see them splitting the world into this very us versus them, that you find that basically instead of saying here's the information about the attacks, immediately there's some demonization. And by the way, this occurs on many different media forms, both in the U.S. and outside of the U.S., and it's not specific to one particular political perspective on the news. It actually occurs throughout. There's been many different studies done by communication studies scholars and people who study this, and there's a clear correlation, and particularly there's been more recent studies done since the attacks in San Bernardino, that a lot of the things that occurred, even prior to knowing what was really happening in our community, there was immediately a role by the media of sort of splitting the world into us versus them immediately without having complete information at the very beginning. But we also have to remember they're not the only ones culpable, that we also are just as culpable. And that is that people like watching the news because, there's an old adage in journalism, which is what bleeds leads. If you've ever been on the freeway in Southern California and you've driven and all of a sudden the traffic comes to somewhat of a stop, and then you get further up and you don't see any actual accident on the road, but there's sort of an accident on the side of the road. People are slowing down. It's sort of the looky-loo effect. We like to see and we're interested by sort of these things that happen. So very often the media plays to that. So we can't we can't completely blame them, because if we stopped asking for that kind of news, that we want to look at sort of this us versus them, that there's a constant threat, and we're looking for happier news, the media would of course switch the way in which they report it. So we have to remember that obviously this tends to distort the way that we view the world. Now remember though that violent extremist groups like ISIS, for example, know this, and so they know that they will feed into that. And in this day of social media, it makes it even easier. So let me give you some examples. And that is, there was a study done just recently by the scholars Berger and Morgan, which I would highly recommend that you Google their names and look at their study. It's online for free, where they looked at actual ISIS Twitter accounts. And what they actually found is as you well know, we have this sort of ongoing sort of discussion in the media and also even in some scholarship about how powerful ISIS is because they've used social media. Well, from September to December 2014, in their study, they found that 46,000 Twitter accounts were used by ISIS supporters. Now, how much of they were supporting, we don't know, because obviously you can only base it on what you actually find. But what's interesting about it is that many of the supporters they were actually able to track down through that were tweeting from these accounts were actually in Syria and Iraq. They weren't in the United States, which is not the way the media and maybe others have portrayed it, that there's this growing threat in the United States and we have to worry about all these people who are the growing sort of support for ISIS in the United States and in the Western world. And that just doesn't show out just based on just Twitter alone, and we can see this also based on some other research as well. Now, it's not to say they weren't important, because we do know that each Twitter account in this study had an average of about 1,000 followers. So, of course, what ends up happening is Twitter has been able to disable a lot of those accounts, but what's interesting about it is even if they're just up for a little bit, it does create sort of this echo chamber where radicals get online, they see other radicals, and they speak to each other, and it becomes sort of what we call an echo chamber. It sort of elevates and gets people riled up. So we can't suggest, by the way, that violent extremist groups don't use social media and it doesn't at least motivate people, whether they're directly connected to groups or not, to act out violently. We do know that there are sometimes connections, that people are drawn towards these groups because of things that they've seen on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or many other forms of social media. And so it does actually play a role. And they do that because what they do is they feed what I would call the beast of fear, what we were just talking about earlier. They do this by increasing sort of the ignorance to the groups of people they are talking to. In the case of ISIS, for example, they will suggest this is what Islam says, which is not the case at all. About a year ago, I was speaking on BBC World News, and I made the point, probably a very controversial one, and I said that to suggest that ISIS represents Islam is completely incorrect. That in fact, what ISIS stands for is very un-Islamic itself. What they're doing is they're using very specific passages out of context and distorting them. And we know that violent extremists around the world do this in a variety of religions and a variety of ideologies, which have led to many, many people dying. And you may be asking real briefly why they use Twitter. Well, often it's not just about the reach. It's more importantly because in some of these places, the only sort of technology increasingly they have to use might be a phone that can send an SMS text message. And of course, we do know that Twitter will work with that. With some other types of social media, you actually have to have a more reliable internet connection to do that. Now, let's talk a little bit about hate as a weapon for the weak. We do know that hate is used a lot by those that are actually very weak. Now, why hate probably creates this sense of powerlessness, and after the December 2nd attacks in our community, there was a lot of debate about what would happen afterwards. And I do remember talking to people throughout the community and since then, and you hear a common theme. and that is that people felt that it was a huge problem for them, not because they thought there was going to be another terrorist attack, but it was really the random nature of terrorism that actually really sort of fueled this sort of suspicion of what we call the other. In other words, that how do I know my neighbor is not somebody who's coming from ISIS? How do I know they're not going to be a bigger problem in the future? And often the reality is not the same as what people have in their mind, but when people feel powerless because of sort of this random nature of terrorism attacks in the first place, then of course it tends to just continue to fuel that. A good example of that is if you look at countries where there has been terrorism on a regular basis, you don't see this sort of powerlessness as much at a high level right after an attack, because for some countries it's sort of the norm. Even though they're bothered by it and they want to do something about it, they don't feel as powerless because you almost become somewhat numb to it over time. We see that throughout countries. You see that historically in the past when there were bombings in the UK during the war with the Irish Republican Army. You see that in places where you have continuing attacks like Israel and many other places. And so because of that, but here in San Bernardino, even for those of us who study terrorism and violent extremist groups, we will tell you that even we were shocked, I think very often, that something like this would happen in our community. And I can remember when it happened that we actually felt that way. And so, of course, you can imagine if people feel powerless, then there's immediate reaction. For example, the immediate reaction by some political candidates to suggest that we should limit Muslims coming into the United States, that this was going to stop anything from happening, again, like San Bernardino. And so part of that is, of course, and why people held on to that may have nothing to do with about their views about Muslims themselves. In fact, many of them probably have very little views prior to this about Islam or Muslims. But instead, we know that very often it's that powerlessness and the fear of and ignorance that was connected to sort of saying, yes, we should limit Muslims. Yes, we should be suspicious of these people. Because very often when I've talked to people and taught students, even since these attacks, and we start to talk about what is the reality, many people of all ages, once they realize what the reality of Islam is, things like the fact that there have been Muslims since the colonial age in the United States, and they're not a new group to the United States, that Muslims serve in our police forces and in our military, do a fantastic job protecting us. And once they find all these out, very often that information tends to negate any potential hate or negativity people have towards Muslims and any group for that matter. Information often, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, is usually the biggest weapon you can use to sort of counter hate and rebuild a community after an attack of any kind. And what very often through this process is that those who hate then become sort of victims of those who are doing the terrorizing. We do know that terrorism itself is really lounged in not just killing people, but creating terror in the population where they attacked, to sort of create this divide. And one of the greatest examples of this, it is clearly in every piece of literature, both in Arabic and in English, that ISIS has put out since the San Bernardino attacks, very clear that their mission is to divide the world into an us versus them. It's by sort of creating sort of this environment where people start to be suspicious of Muslims, and then they can say to the people in Muslims in the United States through social media, they want to say, well, look, see, I told you that they don't like us, and you need to come join us in our fight. And some people have joined that and bought into that, a lot less in the United States than in Europe. And that, of course, has a lot to do with demographics and how much American Muslims are integrated into American society versus Muslims in Europe, which are typically not integrated as much into the society there. But these groups use that. They use that to their advantage. And so in a sense, very often the people who are first victimized by the act of terrorism are then victimized, I would argue, again, by basically being divided into these camps of us versus them because they begin to hate based on the attack in the first place. And that's something we absolutely have to make sure doesn't happen. Otherwise, I would argue the terrorists win. Good example of how we know this occurs, by the way, is just, for example, this one statement. We do know there's a lot of child soldiers, people who fought in ISIS who are now defecting, and this young child who just wanted to go by his first name of Nasser, who was a former child soldier of ISIS, said, quote, "They told us, the Americans, the unbelievers, were trying to kill us, but they, the fighters, they loved us. They would look after us better than our parents." So you can see in this case, this particular violent extremist group, ISIS, is using that agenda and saying, look, we love you, these other people don't. This is us versus them. And we see very similar things whenever we've talked to many other groups throughout and not just groups associated with Islam, but groups associated with many different faiths, many different ideology. When people leave those groups, they're often able to tell us almost exactly the very same logic is being used there. Because if you follow Schaeffer's sort of argument of why people hate, as I talked about earlier, he would suggest that, people get together, they gather together, they define themselves sort of as a hate group in a sense, in their own terms. Then they sort of say, okay, this is the target, this is why they're bad people. They'll even sometimes taunt the target, oh, you're dirty people, you're evil people. And often they'll attack first without weapons and then later with weapons, and then sometimes they're trying to destroy that target, which is, of course, what we hope to sort of stop these groups from doing. We do not want to get them to that point. People like myself, we work on these issues. That's partially why we do it, is to better understand why people join these groups, why they're drawn to those attention, and sort of stop getting to the phase of basically of attacking without weapons or with weapons, and obviously killing, destroying of the target itself. So given the context of this discussion, which I think is extremely important in these kind of conversations we should continue to have in our community, the question then becomes is what can we do? And obviously I don't have all the answers, and I don't think anybody does, but I think the best thing to think about is we should always seek what I would call the advice of sages, the people who've been through hate, who may even been involved in hate themselves, and who've come out on the other side and helped to create peace. Gandhi once said, "The enemy is fear. We think it is hate, but is fear." And so as Gandhi would suggest, one of the first things we need to do is eliminate ignorance through education. And this doesn't necessarily mean through universities or colleges, but obviously that is a big part of what we do today, is to try to eliminate this ignorance that could lead to fear and lead to negative action and hate. But also free speech. We have to remember that whether we like the ideas and words that people are saying, and even if they're extremely distasteful, that we need to allow them to occur so that people can be educated about what people believe, and then being allowed to have sort of a counter to that. That is not to suggest, obviously, that we allow people to violently act out against other people, but free speech is actually one of the biggest ways to actually eliminate ignorance through education, and more importantly, and stop people from going to hate, because we do know that people tend to join violent extremist groups. People tend to be involved in hate groups in general when they feel like they don't have an outlet to express their distaste or their for whatever that issue is, whether it be government, another group, or whatever. And in fact, our Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, one of our core principles as a center is the promotion of free speech as through our protection of civil liberties. And I think that free speech is probably one of those biggest ones. It's not to say that we have to agree with what's being said, but that we allow for, in most cases, ideas and words to be said, whether we like them or not. Number two is be aware of our own fears and look at the reality behind those fears. I think sort of self-reflection, asking your hard questions, why do I fear a thing? I have a fear. I used to have a fear of water, deep water, and so today I don't, and I love being in the pool and things like that. But part of how I got beyond that was not just going in, but also asking, why am I scared of that in the first place? And so when we fear somebody else, when we fear our Muslim neighbors, for example, in the post 9/11 environment, but importantly the post-San Bernardino attacks environment in our community, we have to ask ourselves, why do we fear that? Because when we do that, then we know how to address that fear, and often it tends to be ignorance. And ignorance, remember, is nothing more than a lack of information that we can all work towards bettering ourselves through education. Another sage I think we should really think about is Nelson Mandela, who started obviously as somebody who was fighting against apartheid government in South Africa, including the promotion of the use of violent activity to oppose them. And he said that no one's born hating another person because of the color of their skin or his background or his religion. The people learn to hate, and that's very important here. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love, for love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposites. So here's a man who hated his fellow neighbor because of the conditions in which he was living in, and yet was able to, even though he was spending all this time in prison in South Africa, was able to move beyond that and try to learn to love instead of hate. So one of the things, if we take Nelson Mandela's ideas, then we should really think about the following, which is if we identify what we hate and we try to understand it, it's easier then to move beyond it. Because that leads, of course, to number 4. If you try to go beyond hate and you try to understand it, then that's not such a bad thing. It's a first step. We don't have to agree with what's being said, but we can also agree to disagree. So, for example, I may not always agree with my colleagues on a given position they take on some scholarship, but one of the things that we often do is we try to agree to disagree, because that's, of course, where we start to move beyond and not hate. We should also remember that hate is overly exhausting, and so we could actually spend energy on things that are much easier to do. It's much easier to love one another. It's much easier to understand one another. It takes a huge amount of energy to hate another person, another group of people, and we should always remember that as we move forward. Lastly, I think we should think of 2 other sages who've lived through the violent period, one in the United States, one outside, who talk a little bit about how light, and particularly the understanding of another, can be important. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." In other words, we can't hate each other and expect there to be a better solution on the other side. Then instead, it's through understanding. And from outside the United States, we should also think of a more recent comment that was made by the young lady Malala Yousafzai, who was the Nobel Peace Prize winner just a couple years ago. And you may know her as the young woman who was shot by the Taliban in the head and then survived it and has continued to work towards education, particularly for women. She said in 2013 at the United Nations, when she was asked to speak on the issue of how do you move beyond hate, she said, quote, "We realize the importance of light when we see darkness." And as I said myself when I was speaking at the United Nations just a couple months ago, I actually use this quote because one of the things I was thinking about is we've seen a lot of darkness in the world this last year. If you think about the attacks by ISIS throughout the world, if you think about the ongoing sort of civil wars in many countries, some of which we may not even know about, that we always also need to sort of think about, now that we have darkness, we need to think about those sort of little pieces of light that actually sort of bring the world to a better place. And so we can't always just revel in the darkness and the hate. That's really no solution at the end of the day. And at the end of the day, it's really about understanding. One of the things that I, as an educator, Dr. Levin as an educator, even though I can't speak for him, but I think us as a Center for the Study of Hate Extremism is really getting people to understand more about these issues. So one of the things I would highly recommend is that if you ever have questions or concerns, do not hesitate to contact us. So I'd like to conclude by thanking the Human Relations Council of Greater Hemet, San Jacinto, Menifee region, and Miss Mary Morris. And I apologize again, I couldn't be there with you today. But do feel free to contact me at any time. I do have a Twitter at Prof. Grisham. You can feel free to tweet me if you want to. You can also email me at kgrisham@csusb.edu. Or call me at my office, 909-537-5522. We are always willing to come out and talk to people or have people on campus and have these conversations. As well as, of course, we do have a Facebook account for the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, and also a Twitter account at hate_center. Feel free to contact us. Thank you once again for everything that you do in our community, and we wish you the best of luck in today's discussion.